good enough to mention John Kerry's First Mover Coalition. In fact, our parent company, Mainstream's parent company, Aker, are one of the founder members of the First Mover Coalition, and I was asked if I would attend along with my colleagues and be in the room for Secretary Kerry, and I said absolutely not. I have a room to be in, and it's here at the Malin tent. So, but hopefully there's a good enough showing from my colleagues for that extraordinary endeavour. Mike Waffa, thank you very much indeed for guiding us through the ever more complex and yet necessary world of corporate PPAs. Thank you. I now have the huge pleasure to hand the floor to our colleagues at the Global Wind Energy Council. We started this morning very much with a domestic audience in mind. We started at the breakfast talking about Scotland. We then expanded to talk to begin to talk about the global market for offshore wind, and now the global market for corporate offtake. And now we're going to turn our attention to those new markets, the frontier markets, the emerging markets for offshore. And GWEC have been spending a lot of time over the last couple of years, led by Alistair Dutton, who will chair the next session, working with the World Bank and others, helping those countries which have fantastic offshore resources but don't yet have the regulatory structures to incentivize the development. So, Alistair, thank you for sneaking up behind me, and I will hand over the floor to you. Thank you very much.
I'll stand just for the first bit. So we'll invite the other speakers up in a moment. We've got a couple of presentations to get us going with whilst the furniture moves. So if you could bring the slides up, please. Maybe if I press a button, magic. So Alistair Dutton, I'm chair of GWEC's Global Offshore Wind Task Force. I've worked in offshore wind for a long, long time. 7 years at the Crown Estate in the UK, leading first the Round 3 programme and then all the offshore wind projects. And then in the last 4 years, I've been focused on taking offshore wind global. And with GWEC, we've been to a lot of places, and we get even faster now because we can do it virtually. So just a few slides I'll flick through. One of the new tools online is this single web page where you can click on any of the darker coloured countries and it will bring up the resource map for offshore wind everywhere. So darker red is stronger wind. And it also calculates the resource in each of those countries, everything above 7 meters a second average, and then areas to 50 meters water depth for fixed foundations and to 1,000 meter water depths for floating. And then if you add all of those up, you get 71 terawatts, which I'm told is about 18 times the power demand of the world. So resource is good, and World Bank needs to get credit for pulling the initial set of those together, and then GWEC finished off the job earlier this year. So if you want to become a developer, there's the first thing you need. Then looking forward, we see such a dramatic growth. We've had very substantial growth to date from over the last 15 years. And the vans come on. Europe expands both in the countries that have got it, UK, Germany and such, substantially, but also a lot more markets outside the sort of core set at the moment. So you'll know Ireland, Poland, Sweden, Norway, all of those are joining the party. And we should see some early stuff in the Mediterranean. Then China. China's the big boy now, just past the UK this year, in June, I believe. And you'll see there's a little peak this year because they're trying to beat a tariff change, but after that they still go strong throughout this decade and next. But the other Asian countries kick in. I'll say a little bit more on that in a moment. And at last, the US gets going at scale. A lot of preparation has happened, but now we're seeing the projects being fully developed, and particularly along the Atlantic coast. And then next decade, expect the Pacific coast with the floating technology. So, floating. GWEC's outlook last year was a total of 6.5 gigawatts by 2030. we've seen more projects, more confidence in the sector. So our current projection is 16.5 gigawatts. A lot of it's in the last year. But this is accelerating faster than most people thought possible. And that takes us to so many other places, further from shore, but also certain countries that have just deeper waters. And you hear different numbers, but let's say it multiplies the scale of the industry opportunity by 5 because it's such a big additional space. These are, for my sins, I'm also lead consultant for the World Bank Offshore Wind Development Programme, and these are the countries we're working at the moment. We've delivered the Vietnam offshore wind roadmap, which is a 200-page document telling effectively the government where their problems are, how they can be resolved, and allowing them to use an evidence base to put together policy. It's hard work, but it's getting there. And the announcement by the Prime Minister on Monday, I think it was, of bringing forward net zero from 2070 to 2050 must impact their power development plan that has been looping around for the last 18 months. And there was certainly concern that offshore wind wouldn't get in there, but now we're very confident it will, and possibly with some larger numbers. The other roadmaps are in play at the moment with various consultancies around the world. When I say around the world, out of the 22 that showed interest, we cut it down to a panel of 6, and 4 of those are UK-based companies. So a lot of the expertise still is coming from the UK, which is great. I won't run through all of those countries because we need to get into the conversation. Slightly different approaches in some countries. Somewhere like Fiji doesn't need a 200-page report on offshore wind. It needs something a lot similar. And the work that we'll be doing in Brazil looks much more sort of inside the tent, working with the civil servants rather than just writing them a big report, which looks to be quite fun. And then this is where I think it's going. Again, the slide has jumped around a little in transition. But effectively, you've got the maturing countries now, because I personally don't consider any country is fully mature. There are still developments in place as we get better and better and better at doing offshore wind. And then you've got the near term that I expect to see substantial builds this decade, and then the longer term is more next decade. And I keep adding to that slide on the top right-hand corner as more and more countries are showing interest. So a lot of my work now is focused on those countries to bring them into the market, because we've got to solve this problem. 35 gigawatts at the moment, 270 needed at least, some people say higher, by the end of 2030, and we've got to get to the 2,000 gigawatts by 2050. I also have a belief that some of the other technologies are not going to make it, so actually offshore wind's going to have to go even higher. So we shall see. At least offshore wind is a successful technology, and thank you to everybody in the industry. So I'm going to pass over, I believe we have, we're going to bring the panelists up on stage. So if I could invite Elbia Ganun. I'll let you make your own introductions when we get. Take your pick. And then Anna Freeman. So Elbia is the head of Abiolica, the Brazil Wind Energy Association. But we'll do a fuller introduction. Anna Freeman, who's Policy Director from the Clean Energy Council from Australia. And Denise Fontanelle, who is at the European Climate Foundation. Welcome. We first have a presentation from the one panelist who couldn't make it because he was caught by the test and trace yesterday and hasn't got his clearance on his, yeah, he's still happy there. He hasn't got his clearance through just yet, so he's very kindly attending virtually and is going to give a brief presentation, and then we'll get into the questions. So you can start getting your questions ready. Cheers.
Thank you, Alistair. I assume everybody can hear me, and I'm sharing screen. So if anybody could just give me a shout if anything's not working, that'd be good. So yes, very sorry not to be with you today. As Alistair explained, I was contacted by Track and Trace late yesterday afternoon. I've not managed to get a test done in time. And yeah, frustrating not to be with you in the room. I've spent a lot of my life, both academically and working in wind energy in the city of Glasgow, and tremendously proud to see COP happening there this week. So my name's Neil Douglas. I'm a director at BVG Associates. We provide strategy consulting to the wind industry, spending most of our time working in the offshore industry, and within that, in recent years, increasingly involved in the efforts led by GWEC and the World Bank in globalizing offshore wind. So I'm just going to give you a few thoughts and observations on that journey from that perspective. So in terms of our qualifications for this sort of work, we're one of the 6 consultants that are working with the World Bank that Alistair mentioned. We delivered the first of the offshore wind roadmaps for the World Bank, which was focused on Vietnam, and we're presently engaged in delivering roadmaps for Azerbaijan and also the Philippines, as well as some of the supporting work that's being done around the World Bank and ESMAP programme, such as the key factors for offshore wind report. And I'll draw on the findings of that work as we go through today. So just a few points of general introduction. And this session is formally about offshore renewables, but we are focusing on offshore wind. I think it's certainly fair to say that offshore wind is the most mature of the offshore renewables from a number of points of view. It's a proven technology. We've been dealing with modern wind turbines, if you like, for 30 years or more now. Of course, the scale of offshore wind turbines is very different, but we have we have a class of wind turbines that are proven for offshore use, and the supporting infrastructure, foundations, cabling, substations, and so on. So from an engineering perspective, a technical perspective, these can be considered to be proven technology, although still evolving. We can also consider that offshore wind has a low cost of energy compared to other offshore renewables. We've seen the quite dramatic decrease in the cost of offshore wind in the last decade, and that's really what's generating so much of the global interest. And that those markets that were early leads in offshore wind have beaten that path and have shown that cost reduction is possible. But that cost reduction is dependent on a lot of local factors, and I'll come on to talk about that shortly. We also see that the regulatory frameworks and the financing models that are used to develop offshore wind, to enable offshore wind, and to attract the capital are now well proven. They're not exactly the same in every market, but we do see that they attract investment, and governments are able to put in policies, regulatory frameworks that make the industry work. And the last but not least point is that we understand the risks of offshore wind from a technical point of view, but also from a sort of project development, consenting, environmental point of view. So we have a framework of things there that we understand. So looking a little bit more closely at where does it make sense for offshore wind to develop, and there's a few fairly obvious things here, but worth making the point that offshore wind makes most sense where there's good wind resource with suitable water depths close to population centres. So that's kind of a given, and a lot of the mapping work that Alistair referred to earlier provides us with a very sound basis in which to make those judgments. Also makes a lot of sense for countries where there's growing electricity demand, and as far as I'm aware, there's not many countries in the world where electricity demand isn't growing, and for countries with decarbonisation targets. And again, most states and countries are on some level of decarbonisation journey, and we hope, of course, after COP this week that's an increasing list. The other thing that really makes sense is where there are transferable skills and industries, parallel industries that offshore wind can attract resources, attract skills and expertise, fabrication facilities, and so on. All of these things are very important in terms of lowering the cost of energy in a particular country. So a brief word on the advantages of offshore wind for emerging markets. Clearly, it can drive decarbonisation. It provides access to a large volume, low cost, and relatively quick to develop source of electricity generation that is low carbon and can contribute to meeting of targets. But it doesn't stop there. It can contribute to efforts to decarbonise and electrify across sectors. So, we see many countries starting now to look very seriously at how they decarbonise their heat networks and their transportation systems. So the use of different energy vectors such as hydrogen. Lots of talk about the use of offshore wind to generate hydrogen at very high volumes as an energy vector that tackles decarbonisation of those harder to reach sectors such as heat and transport. Another great advantage for emerging markets is leveraging the learning that's been done elsewhere. As I mentioned, Northwest Europe, very broadly speaking, has beaten the path, along with China in terms of being early large volume offshore wind markets. A lot of the learning has been done around getting to proven technology, getting to proven frameworks and financing models. So the journey from a standing start to having a successful offshore wind industry can be shortened for emerging markets, given all of the efforts that, again, have been referred to already around knowledge sharing and enabling on a global scale. Offshore wind offers an opportunity to reduce energy dependency for many countries. It's an indigenous resource. It can be used in country, less dependence on importation of fossil fuels or indeed importation of electricity from neighbouring countries. It also provides an opportunity for countries to attract inward investment, local supply chain, in terms of investing in businesses and facilities that can be part of the local supply chain for offshore wind is a big opportunity. Not to mention attracting investment from developers as well, who may wish to come in and lead the development and ownership of projects in country. And all of that, of course, combines to create economic value, to create jobs. The subject of the just transition and people moving from different sectors into offshore wind, we think is a very important one. And offshore wind absolutely provides that opportunity. So last slide on some of the challenges that we see. So cost reduction, just because we have low cost of energy from offshore wind in an established market doesn't mean that in the emerging market that cost will be realised from day one. There's a journey to go on. There needs to be localisation of supply chain. That requires a long-term vision to be taken by government to provide that stable investment environment around regulation and policy that allows that supply chain to develop, allows investments to be made in the long term, and therefore drive down the cost of energy. We also want to make sure that we see good development, and by good development I mean environmentally and socially responsible development, and that requires very careful stakeholder consultation. It requires good marine planning, and it requires robust assessment processes. And I think the industry believes very strongly that that is something that needs to be globalized standards for that. It's also fair to say that we're talking about high volumes of what is fundamentally a variable offshore renewable energy resource. Offshore wind farms have very high capacity factors. They're very reliable from an availability point of view. But nonetheless, transmission systems will have to develop to absorb more variable renewables. And that requires a whole energy system view to be taken. many transmission networks around the world need to evolve anyway on the basis of how we use energy and how that is changing. So it's not fair to pin all of the cost on that on offshore wind, but it is fair that you take a whole system view before you start talking about investment in transmission infrastructure. And as I've mentioned, that ensuring that it is a just transition, that requires investment in skills, investment in people, and investment in communities to make sure that there's a fair transition as we move away from traditional sources of energy, which provide employment, to new sources of energy and how they might provide employment and economic activity. So hopefully, Alistair, just a few pointers there that might help guide the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. Let's give them a round of applause. Go on. Okay, what we'd like to do is, if you could each do a 5-minute stand up if you want, or just explain your interest in offshore renewables, the organisation you represent and such. And Anna, why don't you start us away?
Right, okay, wasn't expecting that, all good. Hello everybody, my name is Anna Freeman. I'm the Policy Director for Renewable Energy Generation, large-scale generation in Australia for the Clean Energy Council, and the Clean Energy Council is the peak body for the renewable energy sector. We've got over 950 member companies in Australia and have been going for about 12 years now, our industry association, and the growth in the sector in Australia, renewable energy sector, has been phenomenal over the last 5 years off the back of a renewable energy target that the federal government finally and grudgingly agreed to continue. And that saw a massive boom in Australia in renewables, and that boom is sort of tapered off in the last couple of years, but we saw a massive amount of electricity built, and we basically went from something around 15% renewable energy share in the Australian market to up about 28% now. We expect we'll be at 30% by the end of the year. So within about 5 years, we've basically doubled the share of renewables within the Australian electricity market. Obviously, the electricity market is dominated by coal-fired power, and there is a long-running debate within the Australian context about how and when those coal-fired power stations should retire. Many of them are already at retirement age now, and I think there's been an expectation that they would continue until the mid-2030s, maybe 2040s. It's now becoming very clear that that is not going to happen. The cards are falling already as we speak. They are really struggling to compete with the low cost of renewables in Australia. And just to give you a sense of what that cost is, we're talking about now the renewable energy PPA prices being around $45 to $50 Australian, which is about £25 a megawatt hour. And so the coal-fired power stations, even though they may be fully paid off, are really struggling on a marginal cost basis to compete. So we still continue to see solid growth and build in Australia, although we are struggling with transmission in general, large-scale transmission. We have a lack of it. It's really been designed around the coal-fired power stations and their locations, and so sometimes in many of the parts of Australia where the best resource, renewable energy resource is not where the best transmission is. And so that brings in some respects, an opportunity for offshore wind, and it's something that Star of the South, and we've got a representative from Star of the South here today, which is really the most advanced offshore project in Australia, wind project in Australia, is potentially looking forward to take advantage of, in that it can site itself close to some very strong transmission assets near coal-fired power, near large coal deposits, and so as such great transmission assets there. So it is going to be a struggle. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I think it is. It's the economics of offshore will be challenging. It will need to be based on being able to achieve much higher degrees of capacity factors and scale. And I think that's really the attraction for the Australian market, is that you can deliver that scale. We are starting to see some very large onshore wind farms in Australia. 2 We've just had one that is going to commence construction soon, which is a gigawatt onshore. So we are getting very large scale projects onshore, but there is an opportunity to go for much larger scale offshore, obviously, and that will bring some real advantages. So I might leave my comments there, Alistair. Hopefully that gives everyone a bit of a flavour of the context.
Thank you very much. And Elbia, would you like to explain your interest in offshore renewables?
Thank you, Alistair. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad to be here in this discussion. I'm Elbia Ganon, CEO at Brazil Wind Power Association. I have been driving this association for the last 10 years, and we started with onshore wind. The last 10 years we have increased a lot. And when we talk about offshore wind, it's very important to understand how the market in Brazil works. And now I think it's better. And Brazil is a very rich country. It's a very specific situation when we talk about renewables. Because for metrics, will you turn off this? Okay, thank you. So I think it's better. Huh? So Brazil is a very, very renewable country when we talk about the electricity metrics and about the energy metrics. We have more than 80% in our electricity metrics with renewables, mainly with hydro plants. It's about 60%. Wind onshore is the second source today with 11%. And it starts about 10 years, no more than this. Then we have a biomass, we have small hydro plants, then actually we have an abundance when we talk about the source for renewable. This is important situation when we talk about offshore wind. How Brazil is working offshore, how we are thinking about offshore wind. The point there in Brazil is about the competitiveness, because we have abundance, we need to manage this abundance, and the government prepare auctions, this competitive auction for contracting electricity. And wind onshore is very competitive, it's the first source, it's more than hydro plants. For this reason, has been increased a lot. Is about has been increased about 15% per year. But how can say that we have space in offshore wind, and when we have space for offshore wind? I believe that the moment to go to Brazil to invest in offshore wind is right now. Why? We are receiving some investors, and we have been working with World Bank, with GWEC, and discussing with government, with policymaker about the market, about the possibility to attract private investors to change your metrics, because we will not have our energy transition not be with fossil fuel or renewable. We will change the technology. We will put new renewable technology in your metrics. And now we can see that offshore is starting to be competitive in whole the world and can be competitive in Brazil. Nowadays, we think that the offshore is in the same price, and it's a natural gas. Government pay about $80 per megawatt for natural gas. Then we believe that it can pay for offshore wind. Then we are discussing with the government. They are prepare a regulatory framework right now. They will launch this in the next month, in December. We'll have a regulatory framework. We have investors, about 10 companies that are developing a project. This project is in environment license agents. We have 46 gigawatts in process license. I believe that offshore needs to go to auction because it's a very high scale. And we are discussing and try to prepare the market, to prepare the first ocean in the maximum 2 years. Of course, we have other challenges about the logistics, about the ports and transmission lines, and we need to learn a lot with European countries, Asian countries that start to invest first. But yeah, I believe that our market will be increasing in the next 2 or 3 years with offshore wind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Denise, is your microphone working?
Is it? Is it working? Yeah. All right. So hi, I'm Denise Fontanilla. I'm the Associate for Policy Advocacy of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities based in Manila. So we are supported by the European Climate Foundation, but I'm afraid I'm not directly a staff of ECF. Anyway, personally, my interest in wind energy started during my every summer when we would vacation to my mom's hometown in the northern Philippines, which is touted to be the first, well, onshore wind farm in Southeast Asia. Professionally, what we're doing in our NGO, in ICSC, is to help advance the campaign to decarbonize the Philippine and Southeast Asian energy sectors through sound research and analysis and supported by strategic communications. So I've been doing a mix of both policy, advocacy work, and comms. So what we're doing, what we've been doing or trying to do in the Philippines, to be specific, is to help upend that still ongoing narrative that coal is still the way to go because coal is baseload, coal is cheap. We have data scientists, we have former members of our energy department who are part of our team, and our research shows that even before the pandemic, coal has been increasingly expensive and unreliable, and that in fact the rising power prices in our country and rotating blackouts are caused by this inflexible baseload power. So that's why what we've been working on for the past 5 or so years in our energy team is that renewable energy, specifically solar and wind, is more reliable, is already at cost with coal and diesel, and of course the fact that we wouldn't have to import diesel or coal is also a factor for us. We don't actually have offshore wind projects yet, so it's literally an emerging market, and I'm glad that BVG and I believe others have done some studies on our country, but I'm glad to report that our Department of Energy has recently approved 2 service contracts for offshore wind, totaling I think about 1,600 to 2,100 megawatts. But considering that the World Bank has said that the Philippines has a potential for offshore wind of about 178 gigawatts, that's really small, and of course we in the Philippines have to contend with red tape, with we've been continuously pushing for electricity market reforms to level the playing field in the energy sector, given that although it is a liberalized market, the balance is still in favor of our status quo, where around 60% is of our energy mix is coal, then diesel second, even though we have a plethora of renewable energy resources in our country. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to do a few questions, but please think of some yourself, because I'll be passing to you once we've got things warmed up. And we're going to be inclusive, Neil. You're first on. So you've been doing a number of these roadmap studies for the World Bank, and it's been a bit of a journey. Yes, Vietnam, but the other ones as well. Working with you, one of the things I've found is that, yes, countries want good quality, low cost renewables, but it's actually the economic benefits that really light their imagination. So could you talk to that a bit more as to why in particularly emerging markets that's so appealing?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Alistair. I mean, if we look at the reasons any one country might want to get involved in offshore wind or develop an offshore wind program, I mean, there's really no one size fits all. I mean, you know, sometimes it's about energy security, sometimes it's about a demand for power, sometimes it's about driven almost solely by decarbonisation targets. But the one common factor, as you rightly say, is that desire for economic benefit, and we see that in every single market, and we see how government treats that evolving. I mean, I think I touched briefly on it in the introductory slides. I think any country that's looking at developing a new industry that may actually displace existing technologies or existing industries is going to be concerned about the economic and employment impact of that. But I mean, I think this is one of the great things about offshore wind, is that it only works with a local supply chain and workforce. One of the greatest barriers to offshore wind globally is the development of the supply chain and the availability of trained people. So, you know, it goes hand in hand with growth of offshore wind globally, that it will create economic benefit. But yeah, I mean, I think it's entirely understandable why governments want to see that economic benefit locally. And I think one of the interesting dynamics that we've seen in the roadmaps that we've done so far, Vietnam, which is completed, as I mentioned, and Azerbaijan and Philippines that are underway. These are all markets that are countries that are oil and gas states. You know, they've got very large oil and gas industries. They've got supply chains that have already developed to do that. Indeed, they're exporters in many cases, not just of products, but oil and gas products, but of expertise and of equipment and technologies. So you know, there's a huge benefit there for offshore wind to be able to rely on that expertise and supply chain, and it has the added and nice benefit that it directly creates economic activity and employment.
Thank you. Anna, there's a really fresh wave of interest in offshore wind in Australia that I'm seeing, talking to a number of people there. But what will it take to really create the market? You might even mention New Zealand as well.
New Zealand. I don't actually feel very well informed about New Zealand, so I might have to leave them to one side for this. Look, I think it's an interesting question. I think what is the value proposition of offshore as opposed to onshore is at the end of the day the key question. Keeping in mind that onshore wind in Australia is actually pretty low cost. It's hard to beat it actually. So higher cost for offshore. So it's going to work if the scale is large, and probably the siting could be one of the other advantages if we can be closer to the load centres. At the moment, some of the best sites in Australia are in quite remote locations, and they will get penalised for transmission losses, those projects, and that's become a big risk for many projects, and so they're really having to think about how they can locate near population centres and load centres, and that starts to get a bit challenging as we see larger amounts of supply required. We've got one region, for example, in southwest Victoria, where there are a lot of wind farms. and we will get to a saturation point with that community. Even though there is some very high quality resources, there'll be a point where they just don't want any more wind farms, and so that will potentially make the offshore siting more attractive. Particularly then if you can, there's a couple of regions in New South Wales which are also, New South Wales is the region around Sydney. Sorry, talking to people like you should all know, which of course I wouldn't know if you named a county in the UK. So, so New South Wales being the region around Sydney. And there's a few proposals now for projects that are probably only 20 kilometres from major industrial centres, steel, coal communities, etc. So good transmission links, large amounts of load in the area, aluminium, steel. So those sorts of areas then become quite attractive if you can say, okay, we can get it built nearby. There's a great resource. We know Australia's got great offshore wind resources. We've got good onshore wind resources too, but we've got great offshore wind resources. So it really gives you the ability to site it exactly where you want and be a little bit more specific, provided that you can actually get the government approval for those locations, and that's a whole nother topic.
We might come back to that. And Elbia, in Brazil, I've noticed, I mean, offshore wind's been talked about for a number of years, but there's a momentum shift at the moment. So what's your observation as to why that's happening and why the government seem all of a sudden much more interested?
Yes, it's a very good point. I believe that in Brazil, the investors, the market has a very important role to show to the policymaker that offshore wind is, can be good for investment. Because if you talk only about price and competitiveness, maybe it doesn't make sense right now because it's more expensive. But Brazil has a big challenge when we talk about to maintain the security for produce electricity. Now, right now, we are in trouble with hydro plants scarce. Then the main point in discussing that you need to diversify the metrics, diversification of our metrics. Then we haven't talked with government and say that we have a lot of onshore. We will not finish with your potential onshore and after start offshore, because it will not happen, because we have only potential for onshore 4 times more than the necessity of the metrics in Brazil. But we say that it's important to put investment in offshore because you can have renewable metrics and you can have security because the production regime is different. It's one point. The second one is about to attract investors, and the investors are arriving despite of that we don't have regulatory framework. But we are convincing as investors, the government, that it's time to prepare our market to receive investments. And we are looking for, in 2030, to have a green hydrogen. And the green hydrogen, you can produce green hydrogen with offshore too. Then with this argument and discussion, we can convince the government the time is right now. And for this reason, the Minister Bento decided to start with offshore now.
That's good. And Denise, in Philippines, I attended a meeting with her Undersecretary, and I learnt a lot. Firstly, how enthusiastic the government is about offshore wind. Secondly, the power growth in the Philippines, I'm told, is about 10% per annum, which is higher than pretty much any other country I know. So how do you see offshore wind coming into the mix in the Philippines?
It's actually interesting that that you talk to someone from the government who's very enthusiastic about renewable energy. Unfortunately, some of our other high-level officials in this current administration do not share the same view. So there's, I'm sure this problem is not exclusive to the Philippines, where there's quite a tug of war among governments, among departments. But for ICSC, we believe that we don't have to pursue democratization or commit to the Paris Agreement for its own sake. That it's really, as was said before, we have the highest power rates in Southeast Asia, second highest rate in Asia, only to Japan, and we're a country of 110 million and counting among 7,641 islands. So, as you see, as you can figure out, our current system of centralized generation, is so backward, and it's so and it can be so frustrating when you realize that it's not even everyone has access to energy. So it's really energy access, independence, security, and with 178 gigawatts of potential offshore capacity, there's certainly a role for it.
I think so. So it's your time now. Do you have any questions? It's a deathly hush. So one of those things that people who know me is, if there are no questions, I start asking the audience questions.
Thank you. With the difficulty that coal is having, Elizabeth Halliday, with the difficulty that coal is having competing, how do you handle the intermittency? Because we can't have coal fail unless you've got the energy reliability issue covered with your renewables. How is Australia approaching that?
You talking about, yep, okay. Look, there's a range of things. One of our members last year said that they'd come up with a new slogan, which was "Water, wind and sun can get the job done," which I quite like. And you just need to add storage. So water, wind, sun, storage. So it doesn't quite rhyme quite as well anymore. But so really, I think that's the story: diversified mix with storage. So pumped hydro and battery storage is the name of the game. Plus, there's obviously demand response and a whole range of other things that need to be looked at. But I think that's one of the areas too where the offshore wind has an advantage in that the generation profile is different from what you might have onshore, and so that provides us with some new opportunities to produce electricity at times that otherwise, you know, the sun has set. Australia, I don't know if you know the solar story in Australia too, but we've got the highest uptake of rooftop solar in the world. Between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 homes now has solar on its roof. So that means, unfortunately, during the day we've got masses of negative demand, which is actually one of the biggest challenges for the market operator at the moment, is this fact that you've basically got very little demand at all during the day. And in fact, South Australia, one of the leading states in terms of the renewable energy transition, is going through periods of time during the day now where it's only running on rooftop solar, which is incredible when you think about it. So these are some of the challenges that the market operator has to deal with. But the answer at the end of the day is we need diversity in the system, and the diversity is good. And the more that we can support these new opportunities for firming. So we're spending a lot of money. The government has put down a lot of money for a massive pumped hydro project called Snowy Hydro 2.0 in a national park of ours. And so that's 2 gigawatts of pumped hydro So expectation is that will be a partner and a complement to the renewable energy share growing over time. And look, I wouldn't be surprised if we're at 75 or 80% renewables by the end of this decade, which for a climate change recalcitrant is a fantastic story. So hopefully the market, the technology and the innovation will mean that Australia will come much further than our politics might suggest.
If I might just interject a little piece as well. Before I started in offshore wind, I was at BP in renewables, but the phrase intermittent is an oil and gas phrase. It was invented for the very purpose. So it's a variable renewable energy, wholly predictable 6 days ahead, and offshore wind's generating something for about 95% of the time. So, sorry. Do we have any other questions? Naomi. Hello there. Since we're in Australia at the moment, what's your perspective on, I mean, Star of the South has been going a long time, and single projects in new markets really do struggle without a regulatory regime. I know the offshore electricity infrastructure bill is going through at the moment, but that's only an enabling framework. What's it going to take to actually give the sector that much more momentum?
Yeah, so in Australia, this enabling framework, I think, is a big leap forward. Because without that sort of investment by the government in regulation and policy, it does mean that it takes a fairly, I think, I won't name the investors in Star of the South, but the actual project is by the CEC being, sort of referred to as it's pretty mad to come to Australia and spend that much money without having a lot of certainty. So I think actually Neil mentioned it in his presentation, that the fact that you now have the foresight to be able to see your way through to construct and operate an offshore wind facility at very large scale in Australia is what you need to really start to give your investors that confidence that they can spend, the multi-million pounds that are needed to develop an offshore wind farm. I think someone told me that the cost of developing an onshore wind farm in Australia is about 15 million Australian dollars. And, for Star of the South, we're in the hundreds of millions. So the actual scale of investment that's needed is so much more. And therefore, to have the legislation and the policy and that emerging roadmap, that just allows us to get that investment with more confidence.
And can I ask who would buy the power?
So, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, I guess, in that Anna mentioned PPAs in Australia are low in price, and you've also got this need for diversification. So, just speaking purely on our own project, it's an area that we are focused on and that we are putting a lot of energy into, and we are, I guess, actively negotiating with parties to secure the off-take arrangements, but as of yet, that's not been fully bottomed out.
Okay. Certainly, our observation is very different in different countries. Please.
Can I just make a comment on about a completely tangential issue, which is one of just thinking about the learning curve that there is for a country to go through in developing an offshore industry when they've already got an onshore industry. One of the things I marvel at, having been looking after planning, environmental and social license to operate issues, is the difference in stakeholders as well that there is associated with offshore wind. It's a completely new world, and it's the sort of thing that Naomi can talk about better than I can, because but there's very strong interest from the union movement, particularly the maritime unit. They effectively are one of the main drivers in promoting the industry locally, because they see a massive opportunity for new jobs for their sector. Fisheries, not something that any of my onshore wind members know anything about, So a very steep learning curve is associated with that. Marine spatial planning, offshore marine environmental surveying, these are all completely new things. So the message is we've got about a dozen projects now that are, let's say, on the drawing board. Some of them might be press release status only, with nowhere near as much work that Star of the South has done. But there's going to be need for a lot of expertise down under over the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years, if this industry picks up. So that's just a general note of advice if anyone's looking for some warmer weather and longer daylight hours. You might consider Australia at some stage as the industry picks up.
I think you make a really good point. Sorry, was there something you wanted to say?
Yeah, so just adding to your point, we in the civil society movement in the Philippines and in Asia working on the energy front, we've been so focused on just opposing coal and now avoiding fossil gas being pushed on in our countries and many others in the global south. But for example, offshore wind is just so novel a thing for many of my colleagues and even for myself. I do have to admit I had to call some of my colleagues first to check if we do have offshore wind projects already. So it's that's why our organization as well we've been partnering with our fellow energy think tanks across the world, particularly in Latin America and Africa. So it's called the South-South Collaborative on Energy Transition because because we need to find new audiences, new constituencies. We need to discover more solutions towards the energy transition to make sure that while it is underway, it is accelerated at a much faster pace than it is now.
But the stakeholder point, I think, is really important. And frankly, having worked in an awful lot of different countries, nobody's got stakeholder engagement really done well. I'd say the closest is the US, where they have these intergovernmental forums well before they even define a seabed area. But
I'll make a point on that one too,
sure.
if I can, which is that we're finding now that a lot of the stakeholder angst around renewable energy projects, traditionally it's been in recent years, it's mostly been with farming communities, as you would know. But what we're starting to see now is a lot of concerns, particularly about the transmission assets associated with the projects. So it's not so much the wind turbine or the solar panels that you'll find, but it's in fact now the transmission assets that we need to connect stuff. Because some people like myself will consider wind turbines and solar panels to be beautiful, not everybody, but to be beautiful, but I don't know anybody that thinks that transmission pylons are attractive. And this is the new front line for us on the stakeholder engagement front in Australia. And even if you are offshore, you are going to need a grid connection on land. And undergrounding is expensive. It is something that Star of the South will be doing, but it is an expensive process to go through that. And you know, again, that's just another thing that adds a level of cost to the project if you need to do that too. So that's one other additional aspect.
thank you.
Sorry, Alison.
Oh, great. Any other questions? We have one over there, please.
I have is obviously offshore wind costs have come down considerably over the last decade. How much further do the panelists think costs can come down in the future?
Neil, did you get that one?
Yes, I heard that. Alistair, thank you. So in established markets, I think there's still cost reduction to be done. we will see increasing sort of modularization and standardization of balance of plant, of foundations, and so on. I think that's one of the big aims of the industry is to get to a settled platform. We're still seeing remarkable growth in the size of offshore wind turbines, which means that it's difficult to standardize foundations and it's difficult to standardize installation vessels, just to give two examples, because there's so much cost of energy reduction to be gained from large turbines. But that has a natural limit, and there's a lot of speculation about what that limit might be. But we're now seriously talking about 18 megawatt turbines for projects to happen within the next decade. So yes, in the established markets, that's where the gains will come from. They'll come from efficiency and they'll come from standardization. In the emerging markets, there's a much more dramatic, I think, cost reduction journey to go on, which is associated with that development of the supply chain locally. Principally, that will be what drives it, and driving down risk and uncertainty in a particular market has a dramatic impact on the cost of capital, and that's a big factor in terms of the cost of energy. So through combination of financial measures and sort of engineering and technological measures, still some way to go. And that's just looking at fixed bottom offshore wind. Obviously, we now have floating offshore wind as a very real proposition, and large pipelines and portfolios starting to emerge. And that further journey to go there. There's a lot more technological development, cost reduction, and risk and uncertainty reduction to drive down. But there's no reason to expect that it will remain significantly more expensive than fixed bottom going into the future.
Thank you very much, Neil. So the figures I've seen are saying a further 30% cost reduction by the end of 2030.
Yeah, that feels reasonable.
Do we have another question? Ah, Naomi, you're going to ask a question.
So just to the panel, one of the sort of common features that we see in emerging markets is the expectations of government to have high, sort of aspirations for local content, and they're not always go hand in hand with lowering the cost, which was the last question. So I'm just interested to know, in each of your respected countries, what do you see as being the the opportunities for localization? What is it that you already have within the country that you can draw upon, and where do you see the challenges being?
Elbia, would you like to take that one?
Yes, thank you, Lester, for this question. It's a very good question. We have experience with local content for onshore wind. We started to have a very strong hold in 2013 when we were starting the industry, the investments. And this is a very big success in Brazil because it was, I believe that is the unique case that we got a very, very, very high success with national content. Nowadays, our supply chain is about 80%. We produce in Brazil. We have big companies like Vestas, GE, Siemens Gamesa, and the others. And the point there is because financing, 90% of your finance is from developing bank. Because our development bank can finance infrastructure projects, and for this reason, it's necessary to have a local content. It's a whole. Then I believe that we have opportunity to look for local content for offshore. But Elbia, I have some worries about, because I noticed that this industry is different. The players completely different. I used to say it's a different animal. You need to take care. But I have been talking with investors and companies that want to locate there. Then I believe we have space, but it's important to learn with other countries.
Thank you. So one of my perspectives is that, yes, local content is really important to the politicians, but it's whether you go like Taiwan, where you've got 60% or something, or even component specific has to be supplied in Taiwan. Certainly GWEC does not like that approach, because we think it adds about 20% to the cost, and it's causing a lot of angst, particularly in Taiwan, as to can they deliver and can the local suppliers deliver at quality, and then when they try and internationalize, they'll be overpriced. So we think this is based on a lot of people's more experience in onshore wind than I have. The better approach is to make a commitment of a scale long term and let the market do what the market does. And that's what the Japanese have chosen to do. So they've set targets out to 2040, which, I mean, they very much want the industry to come to Japan, and at the numbers they're putting out there, 21 to 36 gigawatts by that time, that's really looks to be a more compelling one. But we have to accept that even though we've learned things about offshore wind, you have to adapt it to the local politics, fiscal regime, and cultural regime. So we go back to a phrase that Neil used, there's no one size fits all. I thought I saw a question coming out of here. Can we get the microphone to the front?
Just whilst that's happening, Alistair, maybe I could just add a last point there around supply chain. I mean, there are some easy wins in many countries. I mean, operations and maintenance, which forms a very large part of the overall project cost, will happen locally. And some of the markets where we've been active, Vietnam, for example, a very well established heavy engineering and fabrication sector that serves the oil and gas market with the potential to build offshore wind foundation jackets and monopiles and so on. A relatively easy transition. Makes a lot of sense for that to be done locally without necessarily adding cost. But yeah, there's definitely other set parts of the component makeup that could add cost. For example, require a very big market to justify local fabrication of wind turbine blades. So there's a question of scale comes into it as well.
Thank you, Neil. Your question.
Hi there, Alistair Lee from the Ori Capital. There's been a lot of talk of collaboration today, and even within the UK we struggle with collaboration. So within these emerging markets for offshore wind, are we seeing that collaboration to help these markets with the lessons learned from the UK and other developed markets?
Would anybody like to take that, or I'll take it first?
Well, international collaboration, is that what you're going to, or are you thinking international or collaboration domestically?
International collaboration.
Yeah. Look, I'm sure that in Australia there would be lots of people from the global network willing to come and help establish an offshore wind industry. Get good offers of support from the Global Wind Energy Council as well from our point of view, given that it's completely new to us as well. I don't know yet, but I think there's a willingness and a desire to help Australia. I think there's certainly an acknowledgement of the tremendous potential that Australia has. Australia has an aspiration. I'm not sure if the government uses these terms, but industry and businesses definitely recognise the potential for Australia to be a clean energy superpower. I don't know if this phrase has got to the UK yet about this potential, but with basically the best complementary solar and wind resources in the world in one place, plus access to proximity to Asia, incredible resources, mineral resources that are good for battery production, potentially green steel using our iron ore, so creating renewable hydrogen and then using that for direct iron reduction onshore in Australia. So this opportunity to use an incredible renewable energy resource that we have to massively expand our role in the global energy sector. You may have also heard about a project which is 17 to 20 gigawatts of solar in Central Australia with a transmission link, which would be the largest transmission link going to Singapore, with the idea of creating that connection, a transmission connection. So there's incredible potential. I think that's recognised by industry, and I think I have a very strong sense that there's a desire for particularly the sector that's looking for growth opportunities in emerging markets to come and help, and I'm sure we will be looking for opportunities to draw on case studies and examples and learnings from the market here wherever we can.
The other collaboration that I see is there's more and more interested parties to collaborate to grow this offshore wind story. We've mentioned GWEC and the World Bank, but there's Danish Energy Agency, the German equivalent, Dutch as well. And there are countries that are hungry to learn. Some still think that you can take onshore wind offshore, but offshore wind is more like oil and gas in terms of its project complexity and issues to be done. But they are listening, and the report that Neil referred to, this key factors for successful development of offshore wind in emerging markets, it's quite a catchy title, is a real distillation of the experience that we've had in the last 30 years. And I have to say, great compliments to BVG and Arup for pulling that together. I was in one of the controlling groups, but to try and get all that knowledge into 90 pages, including pictures, stunning. But it has 39 case studies. It has 327 references. You know, it is already being called the Bible of offshore wind. And that in itself is a collaboration to pull that together, because it was peer reviewed across the industry. And so these emerging markets are getting more and more help, is the point I'd like to make.
For the Philippines, the company which got the two service contracts were Offshore. It's a joint venture of a German, Swiss, and Filipino company. So there's that. The first onshore wind project was with the Danish agency. So we do. We are also actually seeing homegrown Filipino energy companies which are already investing in energy projects in Vietnam and even Australia, Thailand. So sky's the limit, or maybe ocean's the limit, I suppose.
Alistair?
Yeah, go for it.
Thank you. No, just to add another sort of dimension to collaboration. If we look at, the North Sea basin, for example, where we've got a lot of offshore wind, the UK's been developing offshore wind, Denmark, Germany, Belgium, France to an extent as well. There's a number of countries all around that sea that have collaborated and developed a common supply chain. We will start to see that emerge in other parts of the world as well. So, in Asia, we've got Vietnam, we've got Japan, we've got China, we've got Philippines, we've got, might be a much bigger region to recognise that. But we will see sort of common supply chains in a sort of regional cluster start to develop, which I think starts to make a lot of sense.
Thank you, Neil. Do we have another question? Otherwise, over here.
Thank you. It's Jennifer Malcolm from BIVA. I've got a question for Elvia, please. You mentioned that there's about 46 gigawatts of projects going through the consenting process. I was just wondering if you had any insights as to how they will be dealt with in the new regulatory framework. And specifically, I'm wondering if you have insights as to whether they would be, kind of dealt with separately through a consenting process, or whether those would be perhaps folded into an auction process. And I suppose I'm looking across the water to, kind of what's happening in Ireland at the moment where they've got a new, kind of regulatory framework coming in, but they are dealing with 7, well-developed projects which they've designated as relevant projects, and they're going to go through the consenting process, separately ahead of any potential auction processes. And then in Germany, they're dealing with that by way of step-in rights into auction processes. So it was just really to know if you have any insights on how developing projects which are already in the consenting process may be dealt with as part of the new regulatory framework which is expected.
Yeah, actually, there are some points that's not clear for us because we are discussing in the Constitution the regulatory framework is close. The regulatory framework that we have for hydro plants, because we have we say that it's a concession for public service. And in January, we prepare auction for hydro plants that we sell, we give authorization and they governed by electricity. And this is a separate process. Then, and this project needs to go to auction with environment license. And it's basically, it is in the law for any project that go for the auction. About offshore, there are points that make things a little bit more complicated because you are talking about the rights in the sea, and then we need to treat in regulatory framework about the rights in the sea, to use the sea, to explore the sea. We need to have other regulatory framework about environment, and the third one for ocean. But what we are doing now, it's we believe that environment, that's okay. We have a law for this, for any projects in the sea. We need to have regulatory framework for concession for the services for use the sea. And this year, and the point is this one that the government has announced that they have the way that you prepare this concession, this process, and we are studying German, UK experience. Then I believe that we have something. We need to have a mixed process. Maybe as German started and UK started, because now we have investors that they are there studying projects, and we need to give a solution for these investors. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we've got to that time. Thank you very much for your attendance. A big thank you to the panel, and there's lots happening in emerging markets. Go out and find them.